You look at the landscape of modern cardiology today, and it almost feels like we're living in a science fiction novel, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we've got robotic surgical suites, gene therapies.
Right. Gene therapy is actively editing DNA to stop cholesterol buildup, and these newly engineered blockbuster drugs that can easily run like $100,000 a year.
Yeah, the whole narrative is that the future of medicine has to be this high-tech, deeply complex, and incredibly expensive endeavor.
Exactly. But here's the crazy part. The biggest minds in cardiovascular research are currently locked in this fierce, decades-long debate over a treatment that is essentially a 200-year-old extract from the foxglove plant.
Yep, the Digitalis family of drugs.
Right. And in most of the world, this stuff costs about 10 cents a pill. So why does this cheap, ancient plant extract keep forcing its way back into the spotlight alongside these multi-million-dollar medical marvels?
It's such a striking contrast, isn't it? Cardiology is totally obsessed with the bleeding edge, yet it just can't seem to quit Digitalis. And to understand why, we really have to look at the enemy it's fighting. I mean, when you hear heart failure, what's your first instinct?
I think most people assume the heart just completely stops, like a sudden cardiac arrest.
Exactly. But clinical heart failure is a chronic, relentless progression. You have to think of the heart as a mechanical pump.
Okay.
And in this condition, the muscle has just become too weak or too stiff to meet the body's demands. So it is still beating, but it's basically losing horsepower over time.
And the reality for the patient living with that failing engine is just brutal because the pump is failing to move blood forward efficiently. Fluid backs up into the lungs.
It's terrifying.
Yeah, patients describe this profound breathlessness. It's essentially a sensation of drowning on dry land.
Right.
There's this heavy exhaustion that just settles into the bones.
And the fluid builds up in the lower extremities, the abdomen. It's awful.
And maybe the most devastating part is the loss of independence, right? Because it triggers these recurrent emergency hospital admissions.
Yeah, that cycle of hospitalization is really the true anchor of the disease. A patient's world just shrinks.
Like a walk to the kitchen feels like a marathon.
Exactly. And every time that fluid overload forces them into the ER, it takes an irreversible toll on the heart muscle itself, not to mention the psychological toll on the family.
Definitely.
So the goal of modern therapy isn't just, keeping the patient breathing, it's keeping them out of the hospital wards so they can actually live their lives.
And that is the exact metric we are tracking today for you.
Yeah.
Our mission for this deep dive is to map the chaotic, controversial modern history of this 10-cent pill.
It is quite a ride.
It really is. We're going to look through the lens of 3 massive clinical trials: the DIDE trial from 1997, the Digit-HF trial from 2025, and the Decision trial from 2026.
All trying to answer the same fundamental question.
Right. We want to know if Digitalis is making a legitimate comeback, if its benefits are just too niche, or if the cardiology world is just stubbornly clinging to an outdated remedy. Okay, let's unpack this.
So let's start with the event that originally pushed this drug off a cliff. Back in 1997, the medical community launched this landmark study called the DIG trial.
And this was a massive undertaking, right?
Oh, huge. They enrolled 6,800 heart failure patients. Specifically, they were looking at folks with reduced ejection fraction.
Let's define that jargon real quick for the listener. Ejection fraction. If you think of the heart like a sponge, ejection fraction is simply the percentage of blood the heart manages to squeeze out with each beat.
That's a perfect analogy. So their hearts had severely lost their squeezing power. They gave half the group Digoxin, which is the most common Digitalis drug, and the other half got a placebo.
And the primary question was pretty straightforward, right? Does this plant extract actually save lives?
Yeah, and the data came back with a resounding no.
Wow. Just flat out no.
Yeah, over an average follow-up of 3 years, the mortality rate was virtually identical. About 35% of the patients in both the digoxin group and the placebo group died.
So it offered absolutely no survival benefit.
None. And in an era where researchers were desperately looking for a definitive cure, or at least a life-extending miracle, that headline was a massive disappointment.
But, burying the drug over that one single metric kind of ignores a massive secondary finding in that exact same paper, doesn't it?
It absolutely does.
Because digoxin didn't change the mortality rate, but it dramatically altered how those patients lived the remaining years. The hospitalizations for worsening heart failure just plummeted.
Right, the numbers were striking.
Yeah. The placebo group saw a hospitalization rate of 34.7%, but the digoxin group dropped down to 26.8%.
Which is huge.
Right. In absolute numbers, that is thousands of patients avoiding the emergency room, avoiding the ICU, and getting to sleep in their own beds.
Which makes the subsequent abandonment of the drug so perplexing on the surface. Like, if it achieved this major quality of life goal, why did its use just plummet?
Yeah, what happened?
Well, the downfall was driven by a triad of physiological and pharmacological realities. First, digoxin has a notoriously narrow therapeutic index.
Meaning the dose has to be perfectly precise.
Exactly. The margin of error between a helpful clinical dose and a toxic overdose is razor thin. At a cellular level, Digitalis works by inhibiting the sodium-potassium pump in the heart muscle cells.
Okay, I'm following.
This leads to a buildup of calcium inside the cell, which then increases the force of the heart's contraction.
But I'm guessing too much calcium's a bad thing.
Very bad. If you inhibit that pump just a little too much, the calcium overload triggers dangerous rogue electrical signals.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, patients experience severe arrhythmias, nausea, and even these weird neurological symptoms, like visual disturbances where everything takes on a yellow halo.
That's wild. It's almost like tuning a high-performance engine. You know, a tiny adjustment gives you more torque, but 1 millimeter too far and the whole thing just detonates.
That's exactly it.
And from what I understand, maintaining that perfect tune is incredibly difficult because of how the body actually clears digoxin. It relies entirely on the kidneys, right?
It is the Achilles heel.
Yes. But as we established earlier, heart failure means the pump isn't pushing enough blood around. So if the kidneys aren't getting enough blood, they start to fail.
Right.
And if the kidneys fail, they stop clearing the digoxin.
Yeah.
So a dose that was perfectly safe on a Monday suddenly becomes highly toxic by Friday simply because the heart failure progressed.
Exactly. The pharmacokinetics just made it a nightmare for clinicians to manage safely. Retrospective data from the Didox trial later confirmed those exact fears.
Like proving that higher doses were dangerous.
Yeah, patients who happened to have higher concentrations of digoxin in their blood actually had worse outcomes, including higher mortality.
Oof, that's scary.
It was. So you combine that intense fear of poisoning patients with the arrival of these revolutionary new classes of drugs in the late 90s and early 2000s.
Like the beta blockers and ACE inhibitors.
Right, which actually did prove to prolong life. And digoxin was just swiftly relegated to the history books. It was viewed as a dangerous, difficult-to-manage relic that was totally outclassed by modern engineering.
Which brings us to the twist.
Yes, it does.
We jump forward nearly 30 years to 2025. The medical community now has a full arsenal of modern wonder drugs. Digoxin is barely an afterthought. But suddenly, researchers published the Digit-HF trial signaling a potential comeback.
But there's a catch.
Right. Looking closely at the methodology, they didn't actually use the same drug. They tested a close cousin called Digitoxin with a T.
Very important distinction.
So, applying some deductive reasoning here.
Yeah.
If the fatal flaw of the old drug, digoxin, was that it relied on failing kidneys to clear it, I'm assuming researchers swapped it for Digitoxin because it utilizes a different waste disposal system in the body.
That is the exact biological loophole they utilized. Digitoxin is highly lipophilic, meaning it dissolves readily in fats, which completely changes its metabolic pathway.
Oh, interesting. So where does it go?
Instead of relying on the kidneys, Digitoxin is processed and eliminated primarily by the liver through enterohepatic excretion.
So for a heart failure patient with wildly fluctuating kidney function, the liver just takes over.
Basically, yeah. It acts as a pharmacological backup generator. The blood levels of the drug remain remarkably stable even if the kidneys are starting to shut down.
Wow.
Yeah, it completely neutralizes the biggest safety hazard that terrified doctors back in the 90s.
Okay, so they recruited over 1,200 patients for this Digi-HF trial. And what's crucial here is the baseline, right? These patients weren't just taking this old plant extract on its own.
No, not at all. They were already on maximum medical therapy.
Right. They were taking beta blockers, mineralocorticoid receptor antagonists, and a lot of them were on the newest blockbusters, the SGLT2 inhibitors. They essentially threw this 200-year-old drug on top of a state-of-the-art 21st century regimen.
And the results were surprising. The headline reported a hazard ratio of 0.82 for the primary endpoint.
Okay, let's put that in plain English. The patients taking the Digitoxin had an 18% lower risk of the primary outcome compared to the placebo group.
Exactly. And finding an 18% additive benefit on top of heavily optimized modern guideline-directed therapy is, well, it's incredibly difficult to achieve.
I bet.
It suggested that this ancient compound was addressing some physiological pathway that all the modern wonder drugs were somehow just missing entirely.
Okay, I have to push back on that headline, though, because the details of that 18% reduction are a little messy, aren't they?
They are, yeah.
Because the primary outcome was a composite metric, meaning they combined the risk of death and the risk of a first heart failure hospitalization into one bucket.
Correct.
And when you separate them out, neither the reduction in death alone nor the reduction in hospitalization alone actually hit the threshold for statistical significance. Add in the fact that over 50% of the patients in both the treatment and placebo arms ended up stopping the trial medication for various reasons, and I don't know, that 18% benefit starts to look a little fragile.
That is a completely valid critique. The high dropout rate introduces a massive amount of noise into the data. But what's fascinating here is the biological signal cutting through all that noise. That's what really captured the attention of cardiologists.
Because of how it works.
Right. The question isn't just about the math, it's about the mechanism. If modern drugs are so comprehensive, how is this plant extract still exerting any measurable positive force?
Okay, so what's the answer?
It lies in the autonomic nervous system. See, in chronic heart failure, the body panics. It senses the drop in blood pressure, and it activates the sympathetic nervous system, the fight-or-flight response.
Oh, so it just floods the system with adrenaline.
Exactly. It's desperately trying to whip the failing heart muscle into working harder and faster.
So it's essentially treating a failing engine by flooring the gas pedal. I mean, over time, that constant adrenaline bath just accelerates the damage to the heart muscle.
Spot on, and that is exactly where Digitalis steps in. Beyond its direct effect on the heart's contraction, Digitalis glycosides significantly enhance the parasympathetic nervous system, the body's rest and digest network.
Okay.
It increases vagal tone through the vagus nerve, which acts as a powerful brake pedal against that adrenaline storm. It essentially tells the heart to, slow down, relax, and fill more efficiently.
Oh, wow. So the Digit-HF trial basically suggested that even with modern beta blockers trying to shield the heart from adrenaline, the vagal stimulation from Digitalis provided this unique additive layer of protection.
Precisely.
Okay, so 2025 gives us this fascinating, maybe statistically noisy physiological signal. But researchers weren't satisfied with a composite endpoint on a cousin drug.
Well, no, they wanted hard proof.
Because just 1 year later, in 2026, we get the Decision trial. And this was designed as the ultimate modern reality check. They actually went back to the original, highly stigmatized drug digoxin.
They did.
But looking at the trial design, they deliberately recruited the exact demographic everyone was terrified to give this drug to in the first place.
Yeah, it was a bold move.
Right. The 1,001 patients had a mean age of 72. Almost 30% were women, and nearly 30% had atrial fibrillation. And historically, retrospective data suggested digoxin was actively lethal to those specific groups.
True, but the Decision trial investigators understood something crucial. The historical toxicity wasn't an inherent flaw of the drug itself, but a flaw in how doctors were dosing it back in the 90s.
Ah, okay.
So they implemented a highly rigorous, algorithm-driven dosing strategy. They didn't aim for maximum contraction force. They aimed strictly for that neurohormonal vagal benefit we just talked about.
By keeping the dose super low.
Exactly. They rigidly targeted a serum digoxin concentration of 0.5 to 0.9 nanograms per milliliter. That is a microscopic, ultra-low dose designed to keep the patient entirely out of the danger zone.
Okay, so they played it extremely safe, and the primary outcome they measured was total worsening heart failure events and cardiovascular mortality.
Yes.
And the results showed a rate ratio of 0.81 favoring the digoxin group. So basically, patients on the drug experienced fewer bad events.
They did.
But the p-value attached to that 0.81 was 0.133. And in the strict realm of clinical science, a p-value above 0.05 means you cannot mathematically rule out that the result was just a statistical fluke.
Right. It officially missed the mark for statistical significance.
So what does this all mean? Does that single number mean the Decision trial was a total failure and the drug is useless?
Well, no. Interpreting clinical trials requires looking beyond just a binary p-value. You have to understand the context of the trial's execution. A non-significant p-value means direction is not proof, right?
Right.
But we have to investigate the variables that eroded that statistical power. And the Decision trial had the terrible misfortune of beginning patient enrollment in July 2020.
Oh, no.
Yeah. The global COVID-19 pandemic just completely fractured the infrastructure of clinical research.
I mean, if a trial relies on incredibly precise, algorithm-driven blood draws to keep patients in a zero point 0.5 to zero point 0.9 window, a pandemic that shuts down outpatient labs and forces doctors to monitor patients over Zoom is going to completely devastate your protocol.
It was a logistical nightmare, and it resulted in massive discontinuation rates. Nearly a quarter of the patients in the digoxin arm and over a fifth in the placebo arm simply stopped taking the study medication.
Wow. Yeah, when a quarter of your treatment group isn't taking the treatment, the statistical contrast between your two groups naturally just evaporates.
Exactly. And furthermore, the decision trial collided with a massive paradigm shift in baseline cardiology care. Remember those SGLT2 inhibitors you mentioned earlier?
Oh yeah, let's explore that shifting baseline because SGLT2 inhibitors fundamentally changed the math while the trial was actively running, right?
They really did.
Because these were originally developed as diabetes medications to lower blood sugar. But then doctors realized they were miraculously effective at treating heart failure.
Yeah, from a mechanistic standpoint, they alter how the kidneys handle sodium and glucose. So they act as an incredibly efficient diuretic.
They pull excess fluid out of the body, which immediately reduces the volume load that the failing heart has to pump.
Right, and as the trial progressed, overwhelming data was published proving just how effective SGLT2 inhibitors were.
So ethically, the treating physicians had to start prescribing them to the trial participants.
Exactly. But the adoption wasn't symmetrical. By the end of the trial, a significantly higher percentage of patients in the placebo group had been placed on these powerful new diuretics compared to the digoxin group.
Oh, wow. So when your placebo group receives an unscheduled influx of a highly effective modern therapy, the gap between the placebo and the study drug just naturally shrinks.
And that drives the p-value higher.
But the researchers anticipated this noise,
Right.
which led them to conduct an exploratory on-treatment analysis.
Yeah.
They basically stripped away the patients who dropped out, they ignored the pandemic disruptions, and looked exclusively at the data for the patients who actually stayed on the low-dose digoxin and remained in that safe blood concentration window.
And the math completely flipped.
Really?
Yeah. The incidence rate for worsening heart failure was substantially lower in the digoxin group, and the p-value dropped to a highly significant 0.015.
Okay, but it is vital to classify that as an exploratory analysis, right? Because it filters the data post hoc, so it can't be used to declare a definitive clinical victory.
That's true. However, from a pharmacological standpoint, it provides a massive, undeniable signal. It confirms the underlying hypothesis. If you can keep a patient on this drug and you strictly monitor their blood levels to ensure they stay in that ultra-low vagal stimulation zone, the drug actively prevents heart failure from worsening.
Okay, so to really understand the modern consensus, we can't just look at Decision or Digit-HF in isolation. There was a highly illuminating analysis published in JAMA recently that took a macro view.
Oh, the pooled analysis, yes.
Right. They pooled the data from the original big trial, Digit-HF, and Decision. They aggregated the outcomes of over 9,000 participants.
Which is a massive data set.
Exactly. And when you merge all that data, washing out the individual trial anomalies, the pooled results showed a 25% lower risk of a first worsening heart failure event for patients taking Digitalis.
That's incredible.
It still showed zero significant reduction in overall mortality, but that 25% drop in hospitalizations is a massive reproducible signal across 3 decades of study.
And the pooled data from JAMA also delivered the final verdict on the toxicity debate.
Right, the fears about older patients and women.
Exactly. The intense fears that Digitalis is uniquely dangerous for older patients, for women, or for those with atrial fibrillation were definitively neutralized.
So it's safe.
When administered properly at low doses with modern monitoring, the rates of serious adverse events were practically identical between the Digitalis groups and the placebo groups across all those demographics.
So we have a drug that is safe when monitored, dramatically reduces hospital visits, and costs literal pennies, which kind of forces us to address the economic elephant in the room.
Oh, absolutely.
Why, after 2 centuries, are we still relying on mathematically messy trials with high dropout rates and exploratory sub-analyses? Why hasn't someone just funded the definitive, flawless 20,000 patient mega trial to settle this once and for all?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it is entirely a function of pharmaceutical economics. Running a flawless multinational clinical trial with airtight monitoring and zero dropouts costs hundreds of millions of dollars.
Right.
And the pharmaceutical industry is built on a return on investment model. When a company engineers a novel gene therapy or an SGLT2 inhibitor, they secure an exclusive patent.
Meaning they can charge whatever they want.
Right. They can charge thousands of dollars per prescription, recouping their investment and funding the next wave of research. Digitalis is a generic plant extract. There is no patent.
So no company is going to invest $300 million to prove the efficacy of a drug that anyone can just manufacture and sell for 10 cents. The profit margin simply doesn't exist.
Sadly, no.
So independent researchers are just forced to scrape together government grants, navigate slower enrollment periods, suffer through pandemic disruptions, and make do with smaller sample sizes.
Which pretty much guarantees that the data will always have some degree of statistical noise.
Man, that's frustrating.
It is, which is why the practice of medicine requires clinicians to synthesize the totality of the evidence. You cannot just rely on the headline of a single underfunded trial. You really have to evaluate the biological mechanism, the pooled safety data, and the real-world impact on the patient's quality of life.
Which brings us right back to our initial question regarding that 10-cent pill and the final verdict for you, the listener. Based on the rigorous data from 1997 all the way to 2026, Digitalis is not a miracle cure.
No, it's not.
It is not going to reverse the structural damage of a failing heart, and it has not been proven to buy a patient extra years of life. However, the pooled evidence strongly dictates that when prescribed carefully at very low doses, it taps the brakes on the body's sympathetic nervous system.
Yes, it absolutely does.
It reduces the terrifying episodes of worsening heart failure. It keeps patients out of the emergency room, preserving their independence and their dignity.
And this whole narrative is just a masterclass in how clinical science actually operates. I mean, it is rarely a machine that dispenses binary absolute truths.
Right. It's a messy, ongoing process of revision.
Exactly. We take a flawed, terrifying verdict from 1997, we retest the hypothesis in 2025 and 2026 under completely new conditions, and we slowly refine our understanding of human physiology without the illusion of false certainty.
And now, the responsibility falls to modern clinicians and the architects of medical guidelines to determine exactly how this ancient botanical tool fits into a high-tech 21st century treatment plan.
Yep. They have to weigh all that messy evidence.
It certainly leaves us with a provocative thought to mull over. If a simple, ultra-cheap, centuries-old plant extract can still hold its own against the most advanced, heavily funded pharmaceuticals on the planet, but it struggles to secure the funding to definitively prove its modern worth, what other simple, inexpensive remedies might the medical community be leaving on the tables simply because they don't fit the modern profit model?
It's definitely something to think about.
Something to think about the next time you look at your medicine cabinet, for sure. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the resilient history of Digitalis. If you enjoyed unpacking the messy, fascinating reality of clinical science with us today, please hit the like button on this video and subscribe to the channel for more explorations into the stories behind the science. Until next time.